My name is Eric.Kimberling. I'm the CEO and founder of Third Stage Consulting Group. We're an independent, technology agnostic ERP and digital transformation consulting firm. Wanted to chat today about the real root causes of ERP failure. And about 10 years ago was my first real exposure to an ERP disaster. I was called by a group of attorneys who were representing a party in a ERP lawsuit that had obviously begun with a failure of some sort. And it was a very eye-opening experience. It was a very large, high-profile case that many of you have heard of and probably studied over the years. And one of the things I learned during that is how much goes into failure and all the different mechanisms or the different inputs that can lead to failure. And since that time of being an expert witness on that case, been involved in a number of project recoveries, helping ERP implementations get back on track, and then also a number of additional expert witness engagements on top of that original first one. And then obviously in parallel, also working with our clients to make their project successful in the first place, which is always the cheaper and more effective way to manage your transformation is to get it right the first time. So one of the things I've really been fascinated by over the years is what are the differences between those successes and those failures? From that first case I saw 10 years ago, how was that disaster different from the average success that our clients see? And so over the last few years have been really refining and working with defining what are the different contributors to failure. And just recently at a conference that we hosted, our digital stratosphere event that we host every few months, we did a presentation on lessons from failures and lawsuits. And that was the highest rated session in the conference, as it has been every time we've done the conference and that presentation at the conference. And so it just really got the wheels turning even some more about, how do we really narrow it down and boil down the ocean a little bit more to hone in on what those real root causes are. There's a lot of symptoms, a lot of things that bubble to the surface, but what are those things at the core of what causes problems with ERP failure? And that's really what I want to focus on here today is really to sketch out a model for you and show just through this whiteboard video how root causes lead to symptoms, which then lead to ultimate failure there. And that's what we want to talk about here today. So to start, what I want to do is to, if we look at this from a perspective of what we typically see on the surface. So on the surface, we see a number of issues that transpire. And this is what we read about in the papers and in the media when we hear about a failure. We see that a project took too much time and money. So that's probably the most common, or one of the most common issues, is that there's too much time and money spent on the project. And my apologies, I should say time. Too much money and time spent on projects. We also see that companies don't get enough ROI. So their return on investment for the cost and time that they're spending on the project, they don't realize the benefits that they expect to see. And then finally, probably the biggest line item dollar impact or risk to a project isn't the first two. And in the first one in particular, obviously we're all concerned about going over budget, spending too much time and resource on a project. But the one that's even more of a concern, in my opinion, based on experience, is the cost of operational disruption. So I'm going to list that here as number 3, but in my mind, it's actually the number 1 in terms of priority. But I want to highlight it here for a second that, what is the cost of operational disruption? That's something you've got to think about as you go into your digital transformation. And we think about what would it cost us to not be able to ship product for, say, 30 days? Or what if we couldn't close the books when the period end close happened? What would that cost us? And that's the way we have to measure risk and measure overall total cost. When we're planning up front, we're looking at what the cost of the project is going to look like on paper. We're oftentimes not thinking about operational disruption. And certainly if we manage our project appropriately and address some of these root causes that we're going to talk about, then those issues are largely mitigated. But the problem is that most companies don't adequately address operational disruption or the risks that lead to operational disruption. So that's what we see on the surface. At the end of the day, a train wreck happens, took a ton of time, took a lot of money, got little value out of the system, maybe even no value out of the system if we got it up and running in the first place. And if we did get it up and running, oftentimes there's that operational disruption. What does that mean to us? So then we back up from there and say, okay, that's the stuff we see on the surface. But if we back up and look at what are some of the symptoms, and the symptoms that lead up to these failure points, that, if you will, and these are some of the things that oftentimes it's easy to blame these as the real root cause, but they're still not. We're still not at the root cause yet. We're just peeling back the onion here. So the first one is resistance to change. So oftentimes we find that the team doesn't want to change. They like the way things are. New system doesn't work the way they want it to. Whatever the root cause is, there's some sort of resistance to change. That in turn will then lead you to spend more time and money implementing. You're not going to get as much value as you want, and can ultimately lead to operational disruption. So you can kind of see the connection there. You also see project delays. There's constant delays throughout the project, which snowball and turn into a big challenge. The project overruns and budget overruns don't just happen overnight. They're a series of almost death by 1,000 paper cuts. And so we experience chronic project delays, which then in turn lead to some of the things that we see on the surface. Another challenge is unclear requirements. So we don't know what it is we want out of the system. Hasn't been well defined, hasn't been well articulated. System integrator doesn't understand it. We may not understand it. Whatever the case may be, there's a lack of clarity around business requirements and how the software system is going to support that. There's also slow decisions. So we're slow to make decisions, meters running, time and money is being wasted while we try to figure out what we want to be when we grow up. And that can lead to obviously a great deal of pain later on in terms of when the final bill is tallied. We've spent way too much time and money on this project because we were slow to make decisions around what this project is going to be, what we want to be operationally, how technology and our people are going to align with what we want to be operationally. All that stuff can add up to a lot of challenges later. Really common one we see, especially in expert witness cases and lawsuits, is we'll call it broken software. Software that doesn't work, functionality is missing, didn't do what we wanted it to do. Sales guy told us in the sales cycle that it could do X, Y, and Z, but really it could only do A, B, and C. Whatever the case may be, there's some sort of allegation or concern that the software doesn't work, the software is broken. Now, up until probably 2 or 3 years ago, I would have said this is highly unusual to have a case where a project fails because the software doesn't work. Typically with mature ERP products, you're going to see that the systems work. It's just a matter of, does it work well for our organization? In many cases, what the real issue here is that, we've got resistance to change. So we end up blaming the broken software for that. So there's an interrelation there oftentimes between resistance to change and the feeling that the software is broken. But in the last 2 or 3 years, that's shifted a bit where that still is a real dynamic. But what's happening more often than in years past is that the software legitimately doesn't work because the vendors are rushing to get to the cloud so quickly. In some cases, they're putting out half-baked products that aren't fully functional and don't serve the needs of a client's particular industry or business or whatever the case may be. So broken software has a number of reasons and root causes behind it, but that's oftentimes one of the symptoms we see. And then finally, at least for the high-level top 10 list or whatever we want to call this, we have the resource gaps. So this is a kind of a few different prongs here. One is resource gaps around knowledge of the software, especially with some of this new cloud software that's hitting the market that is still being proven and tested in the market. Finding resources out there that really understand how the software works and how it can be deployed, and drawing on real life case studies becomes a challenge. We've also got resource gaps internally too. So now we've got to worry about not just our system integrator and do they have the right resources to implement, but do we have the right team on our staff? Do we have the right people that understand the business, can bridge the gap between people, process, technology? And then what other third parties are we missing? Do we have the right people on the team that can, be data experts, project management experts, organizational change experts, someone to provide quality assurance to oversee the project? All those things are skill sets and gaps, resources that we need on our project to make them successful. But oftentimes we don't have them on the project, which leads to a number of the other problems that we're talking about here. So this, if we continue backing up here, then we see that these symptoms right here are all leading to some of these on the surface type issues. So everything I've mentioned here ends up causing, in many cases, some of the challenges we see on the right side of the screen. And so that leads us to, well, what causes the symptoms? If these aren't the real root cause, what are the symptoms and the real cause of failure? So now that brings us to root cause. And what I wanted to do here is really just simplify this as much as I could and try to summarize what those most common root causes are that lead to the symptoms, which then lead to the stuff that we see on the surface. And the one that we most commonly see, especially in recent years with high growth companies and big, large multinational companies trying to implement new enterprise technology to standardize operations and to just scale for growth, is we're seeing a lot of misalignment. And what I mean by misalignment is a number of things. One is there's internal misalignment, which is probably the biggest one, which is our team is not on the same page with what we want to be when we grow up, how much we want to standardize, how much flexibility are we willing to give different business units or locations, and other sorts of things. But then there's also the external misalignment too, which I'm going to talk more about this here in a second as we get to the other two areas. But external misalignment is basically misalignment between what our vision is for the project and what our system integrator and third-party consultants are bringing to the table or envisioning for the project. So it's just as important for us to keep those system integrators aligned with us as it is to keep our own team aligned. And if we don't keep both parties aligned, that misalignment is going to drive a lot of challenges later on, which are going to manifest themselves in some of these symptoms we see here. So just as a quick example, if we're misaligned and we aren't on the same page with how much we want to standardize our, pick-up process, our sales process, so our customers feel like they're dealing with the same company and aren't having to deal with different processes and people every time they touch our company. If we're not on the same page on what that looks like, that's going to delay the project. We're not going to have clear requirements. We're going to be slow to make decisions. We're going to blame the software for being broken, not able to accommodate everything we want. And we're going to start to resist that change. So just to kind of tie it all together, that misalignment is huge. And we actually have a whole process and methodology that's focused just on helping get clients aligned prior to starting a large transformation like an S/4HANA or Oracle ERP Cloud or D365 transformation. And watch for other videos on my YouTube channel that cover that in more detail. The other thing that drives a lot of these symptoms you see here is bias. And it's not the bias that you might think. A lot of times companies think that bias is limited to the software evaluation stage. When we decide what our ERP system is going to be, we need a certain amount of a lack of bias in that process. But bias is arguably even more of an issue during implementation, because what it does is it causes you to make a number of bad decisions that aren't in your best interest necessarily. One is, just as an example, we'll call it the vendor first bias. So let's just say, as an example, we've chosen SAP. S/4HANA is going to be our core back office ERP system. If I'm not completely unbiased and I'm turning to SAP to ask them, what do you think I should do, for example, for my HCM or supply chain and procurement processes? What technology would best fit that to help augment what we're trying to do here with our S/4HANA transformation? The answer is going to be from SAP is going to be almost assuredly, it's going to be for HCM, you need SuccessFactors, and for supply chain and procurement, you need Ariba, because those are both SAP products. So that vendor first mentality doesn't necessarily mean it's not client first, it's vendor first. So that's what's in our best interest as vendors to sell. So we're going to sell you SuccessFactors, we're going to sell you Ariba. So that vendor first mentality can create a huge amount of bias that creates a lot of problems that then lead to some of these challenges we talk about over here. The other part of this too is somewhat similar, but also a little bit different. But it's also the technology first bias. It's the bias that is created by us saying we're going to lead with technology, and then the people and process pieces of our transformation will follow. That's a big risk as well, because anytime we lead with technology, we're not leading with what's best for us. We're leading with just that's the way the software works, and that creates a lot of problems later on. So technology typically is not the silver bullet to answer your questions about your operations and your organizational change needs, but rather your operational needs, your organizational change needs should be driving how technology will best fit in to your business. So if we have a tech first bias, that's going to create a lot of problems here. And then I'm going to call another bias the time, call it the time bias. And what I mean by that is, if I'm a software vendor or system integrator, I want you to start going right now. I want you to sign the contract, get as many licensees up and running as I possibly can. And I want to put a team of as many people as I can on this project, because I'm going to make more money off you if I can accomplish those things. So my bias here, and the bias I'm introducing to your organization, if I'm the vendor here or the system integrator, is I'm introducing a time-based pressure that doesn't need to be there, but yet it's going to lead us to bad decisions, in many cases slow decisions. The meter is going to run over time. We're going to blame the software for being broken because it doesn't do what we need it to do. We're going to resist the change, that sort of thing. So all these different sorts of biases create a lot of different problems. So those are the first two things we want to cover. And then the third big bias that we have to watch for here are the blind spots. So in other words, more specifically, we're going to call it the vendor and SI blind spots. So the vendor and SI, we're leaning on to provide us a single throat to choke, a single solution that's going to help us transform our entire business, but no one party has all the answers, and no one party can provide to us what we need. When we rely on them to do that erroneously, what ends up happening is these root causes lead to a bunch of the symptoms that we just described here. And so I'll give you an example, a couple examples. I'll take organizational change management as an example, or data management. Those are two areas that vendors and system integrators will tell you, yes, we can do that. Absolutely, we've got those competencies, but they are almost always not nearly as competent in those areas as they need to be, because you can't be good at everything. And so what they're really good at is designing, building, configuring, testing the software, and making sure that the software, quote unquote, works from a functional and technical perspective. What they're not good at is figuring out, how are we going to redesign our organization to support this transformation, or how are we going to transform our culture to support this transformation? Those are things that have nothing to do with the software, but yet the vendors and the SIs are telling you as a customer that yes, we can do that. Same with master data management. The data is not their thing. I've worked with a lot of different data people, many of them on our team. They're a lot better than any data type person you're going to get from a software vendor, simply because they can't be everything to everyone. They're really good at certain things, but not others. And so we need to uncover those blind spots and understand, how do we augment what the vendor and SI is providing us, as well as, by the way, our own internal, we'll call this internal blind spots as well. If we don't have a lot of implementation experience, we don't have a strong PM, we don't have people that really understand what our future state processes could look like, or whatever the case may be, we want to make sure we augment that and recognize those gaps, and not really just gloss over them, which is a lot of times what pressure you feel early on in a project is. We're just going to gloss over those risks and those problems because we just need to get started. We need to start doing something. And the vendor and the SI and everyone else is telling you, just go, let's just start rolling. So that's a bit of kind of an overview of where I see the three primary root causes. Every project's a little bit different, but if I had to pick a pattern that I see in most project failures and challenges, it's these three things: misalignment, the bias, and the blind spots end up driving some of these symptoms that we see around resistance, project delays, et cetera. Now, having said that, there are cases where you could have standalone risks or challenges that would happen even if you didn't have these root causes. So, for example, the resistance to change. That's one that if we don't have effective organizational change, we're going to see some resistance to change. But more often than not, the bigger resistance to change comes from those root causes that you see on the left side of the screen. Same thing with unclear requirements. If we didn't spend the time up front defining the requirements, no matter how well we did these other three things in the root cause category, unclear requirements is going to become a challenge. So those are a few examples. That's the most common scenario we see. I hope you find this information useful. One thing I would encourage you to do is, I've included a link at the bottom of this page in the info field for this video, is to download our 2019 ERP report, which outlines some of the common success factors that organizations see, and it's based on our research over the last few years of technology agnostic implementation best practices. So download that off our website. I've included a link in our info field on the YouTube channel here. Speaking of my YouTube channel, I appreciate if you could share this channel with anyone that you thought might be interested in it, and also subscribe to it too. You'll get notified every time we put a new video out. So hope you had found this information useful, and look forward to future conversations. Thank you.